Hi, I'm Diana Macedo. We're coming on the air with breaking news in New Orleans. Local police are calling it an act of terror after a man drove a pickup truck through a crowd on Bourbon Street, killing 10 people and injuring dozens. They say the driver then came out of the truck and opened fire on officers, injuring 2 before being shot and killed. The FBI says improvised devices were also discovered in and around the scene of the attack, and those devices are now being tested. The White House also says President Biden has been briefed on the attack.
It's about 3:15 a.m. local time. There was still a crowd on Bourbon Street, a mix of tourists and local residents, when the white pickup truck turned from Canal Street onto Bourbon. Pedestrians, killing at least 10, injuring roughly 3 dozen. Initially, police responded to the first call for an active shooter because there were gunshots. When the suspect exited the vehicle, he shot at. Improvised devices were found at the scene. The authorities have since tested them and determined that at least one of them appeared to be a viable device. So it adds a degree of complexity to this evolving situation. Right now, police are scanning the French Quarter using drones, cameras, and other technology.
Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas, because Pierre, the big question when you think about a day like New Year's Eve, when you know Bourbon Street is going to be heaving full of people, is how does something like this happen? How does a truck even get close enough for this attack to unfold?
Well, the police superintendent emphasized what's going on here. The FBI has taken the lead in this case. They have now investigating this as an act of terrorism. That's official statement from the FBI. They are very convinced that this was clearly an intentional act. I'm being told by multiple sources that they're looking at the possibility that the suspect may have come into the country recently. Again, very fluid situation. They're also looking at the potential for any kind of ties to ISIS. Again, it's very early in the investigation. Nothing has been finalized, but this is being treated as the highest priority right now. The Attorney General has been briefed. President of the United States has been briefed about this. The FBI director directly involved in this case as well. Again, so many people injured, at least 10 dead and 20 plus people injured. Horrific attack in Israel. And the FBI director and his counterparts have been warning month after month that this now codifies what we've seen from earlier this summer with 2 attacks on former president. Resources are being flooded into that area. They are now trying to do a search, a background check on the gun. Where was the gun purchased? Any information they can find out about the vehicle. They're searching surveillance cameras to see murder. Law enforcement treating this with the highest priority.
And I want to bring in the former New Orleans Mayor, Mark Morial, for more. Mayor, thanks for joining us. What's your reaction,
Thank you. Good morning.
first of all, just to hearing that this happened, the way...
Pain for the families of those who've lost people, for the 2 law enforcement officers who've been injured. What would compel someone to carry out such an act? And clearly, it seems as though he planned even more if they found explosive devices or potential explosive devices in his vehicle. This is an area of great festivity. The French Quarter is about a little bit less than 1 square mile. Bourbon Street, of course, the main street, one of the best places to be on New Year's Eve and New Year's morning. I think for the city and for the leadership of the city, the double challenge is to navigate this while at the same time in the city, including tens of thousands who are there for the Notre Dame, Georgia Sugar Bowl game, which is part of the college football playoff. And in a little bit over a month, and the law enforcement community and the civic and business community will want to do everything they can do to ensure the safety of. Got a lot to deal with, the investigation of the current incident, but ensuring that the next 2 big events can be carried out in a safe fashion.
And let's talk a little bit more about that, Mayor. One, how surprised are you at powerful steel barricades weren't up and that they had sort of more flimsy plastic barricades? Again, just one eyewitness account, but that's what he's telling us. And do you think they can go forward with the Sugar Bowl tonight?
What want to do is intimidate people, bring about fear. We have to be strong and resolute. The adjustments to security need to be made and can be made. And I think why those barricades were not up post 9/11 with respect to Bourbon Street to try to ensure that egress and ingress by vehicles is not easy. So there's a lot of answers, a lot of questions and a lot of answers that I think many of us want with respect to how this truck traversed from Canal Street, which is a street where traffic is allowed to flow, but the opening of the mouth, if you will, of the French Quarter is really at Bourbon and Canal. So that truck obviously took a right. The barriers are down about a block. No, right now I think we've got to keep our thoughts, and I think many of us on pins and needles, hoping that want to know the identities of those who have lost their lives, the 28 to 30 people who are injured and are at the hospital. There's 2 law enforcement. That federal law enforcement is being cautious, investigating it that way. But it seems, it looks, it feels like someone that had a heinous motive to carry out a mass killing.
At the White House, because we are told, Elizabeth, that the president has been briefed and he's already spoken to the current mayor of New Orleans. What else are you hearing from the White House?
Right, Diane. The president has been briefed. The White House says he will continue to be briefed throughout the day. He spoke with the mayor of New Orleans, Homeland Security leadership throughout the day. We do know that the White House is calling this horrific news right now. The president says he went from his home in Wilmington to Camp David. We are waiting to see if there'll be any updates to the official schedule to see if the president does make any further comments on this, Diane.
All right. Elizabeth, thank you. And Morgan Norwood has been speaking to eyewitnesses to this attack. Morgan, what are they telling you?
Well, witnesses, Diane, describe an absolutely chaotic scene, of course, unfolding shortly after all of this unfolded, right after that initial press conference. And he told me that he took off running once he heard all of the commotion, hid out in a nearby toss. You can just imagine how confusing that must have been in the middle of, a celebration for the new year. Here's what else he had to say.
So Bourbon Street, like he said, probably about 3:10 a.m. We were heading towards Canal, which is the way the truck was coming at the other end, and it looked like just nothing we wanted to see. So we just ducked off into a club. By the time we got in, 5 girls had ran in frantically and hid under chairs. So us knowing where we were, we ran upstairs to the balcony to make his body after body mangled just as far as you could see. We counted 10, and at least 6 were instantly clearly deceased, and they were trying to get everybody just to stay inside, but everyone had just completely disappeared. Like after these people ran over, I think you don't see stuff like that on city streets. Yeah. And just no one was helping them. Like that was kind of the first crazy thought we had, but others were yelling out, and it's a lot to process.
Yeah, and you can hear how difficult it was for him to process that, Diane, talking about the whole situation in graphic detail, the panic and just the commotion and the chaos that unfolded right there on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, Diane.
It sure was, and I know he's raising a lot of questions about the barricades and what was and wasn't set up. Huge day in New Orleans, a huge day specifically on Bourbon Street. But this is a city also preparing for the Sugar Bowl tonight, and now you're saying there are discussions about whether or not that should even happen.
There are ongoing discussions. Multiple law enforcement sources have told ABC News as to whether the game needs to be postponed or outright canceled because of the number of resources it would take to secure it in light of what happened on Bourbon Street overnight. As of now, the game is still on, but the conversations are. They have called in additional officers from neighboring departments from all around the state to help with security. So they, as of now, plan to play the game, but those conversations are ongoing about how you do this safely, because we know in the immediate, most urgent thing is to determine whether
to address that, because Mayor, you're saying they have to go forward because the goal of terror is to get people to change their behavior, to stop doing things out of fear. But how can New Orleans guarantee that they can put on the Sugar Bowl tonight in a safe way with all the factors that Aaron just mentioned? And looking even further than that, how can they guarantee they can do the Super Bowl?
First, because there's a historic example. I was mayor in 2001 when we were going to host the Super Bowl in January, February of 2002. And at that time, the Super Bowl became a national homeland security event. What that did is it triggered federal law enforcement and law enforcement around the country to come in and work with the New Orleans Police Department for Super Bowls. Super Bowls are somewhat different than a college football game, although it be a bowl game. If there is thought to postpone the game for a day or two, one thing that is implicated is you have visitors from Georgia, visitors from Notre Dame who are there, who have paid to come to New Orleans. Certainly, security is number one, but I do have great confidence that if law enforcement, federal, state, and local work together, they can ensure security for the Sugar Bowl. It means, I think, that these bowl games and these major college football games may need to be given a national home. International, it's a global event with the eyes of the world on New Orleans for a college football game tonight. So I'm hopeful that they will find a way that it can go forward. Of course, if it's going to be postponed for a day or two or three, on people have to also be weighed in connection with this. I have confidence that they can make it safe. I have confidence that we need to be strong. New Orleans has to be strong as a city. We need to be strong as Americans and not allow corrupt.
And I want to go to our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, the Attorney General is now reacting to this attack. What sticks out to you from his statement?
I'm struck by the fact that he felt the need to respond so quickly, Diane. He said, quote, "The country woke up this morning." He also gave an update on the resources that are being applied to the situation. Not only is the FBI there, I can now confirm ATF's department has been activated on this incident. That tells you a lot right there. This is not being treated at all as some sort of, again, all the resources of the federal government now aimed at determining who exactly the suspect is, who he has ties to, what are his connections, to try to come up with a firm statement and answer that they can give to the nation. They know that in a couple of hours, the country is going to want answers as to what is behind us and whether this threat is centralized and local.
Contributor Richard Frankel, because Richard, how do they go about answering those questions now, particularly with the suspect dead?
So they're going to be going through everything in the suspect's life. They're going to be going back to everything that he has done, everyone he has touched, everyone he's communicated with, social media, an inspired event. In other words, was he online being inspired by one of the terrorist groups overseas? Was he just these, or at least being directed in how to make the IEDs? We have seen that in the past where people in the U.S. have built the IEDs, but they've been directed from overseas on how to do that. So they're going to be looking at all of that, and they're going to be looking forward because they want to see if anyone that this individual has been dealing with may also be inspired or be part of this conspiracy in the United States.
And I want to bring in ABC News contributor, former NYPD Chief of Detectives, Robert Boyce, as well. Robert, you worked for many years to secure Times Square on New Year's Eve. I think of the security in New York and how deep it goes, blocks and blocks and blocks. What's your reaction to something like this happening in a place like Bourbon Street?
It happened 3:15. That's significantly after midnight. So things seem to load. The threat level seems to decrease somewhat. Now the next night you have a big, you have a big night on the Sugar Bowl. So were resources sent home? That has to be looked at as well, just to get them ready for the following night. So these things will be looked at. But in the immediacy, is still you have the car. Can you trace that back? You have the gun. Can you trace that back? Does he have a phone on him? We have fingerprint devices that we can, and if you look at the whole community of terrorism, you'll see that there's been a lot of activity in Europe over the past year. So conspiracy. These things are important because there's decisions to be made today, whether they're going to go forward with that game. And I agree with the mayor. I think they are going to go forward with the game right now. We did the same thing in New York. On Halloween in 2017, there was a Halloween play. But right now, everybody's involved here. And you'll see resources from around the state troopers and other police departments coming in to aid the New Orleans Police Department as they go forward into the day.
And Pierre, one of the sources of the investigation now is these current threat.
Well, that is the ongoing concern. Are there more devices? You don't want members of the public or anyone else stumbling around and finding anything else that's this dangerous. The other thing is the gun aspect. Again, my sources say clearly the suspect had time, had put some thought into what he was going to do, both in terms of having the gun and the improvised explosive device. Again, sources emphasize that this was such a cold-blooded, intentional act that they've got to get forward to make sure, again, that this is a contained incident. That is the most important thing right now, to make sure that this is localized and there's no one else out there with follow-on attacks coming. We don't have any information to that effect, but my sources are saying that is
and hard to look at. But Richard, I want to ask you about what Pierre just touched on in terms of needing to make sure at this point and that this isn't part of a larger scale issue. How do you go about doing that and ensuring that other events, including the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans tonight,
is that the area in and around the attack is safe and secure, that there are no more IEDs in that area. Then they're going to go to the location where this done other pre-planning for other locations or actually put IEDs out. So that's also happening as we speak. And then on a completely different level, you're going to have FBI, DHS, local PDs. They're going to be going out and securing the facility for the football game, athletic events, at the Meadowlands. This is not unusual for law enforcement to go and make sure that everything is safe and secure. They may actually take a little bit more time with each person going through. I'm sure that they've gone through the stadium once. They're probably going to be going through the stadium again to make sure that there is no chance of having the location of the bowl tonight may be the safest place, sure that no one is injured there tonight. But again, they're going to be looking very hard at this individual and making sure that he did not do something that may come out in the future, or that there is no one else working with him that may be doing or planning on doing an attack also in the future.
Just making sure that this was a contained attack and not part of a larger plan. But there's also the concern about copycats. How worried are you that someone else watching this may now get this idea to try something similar?
I'm seriously concerned. The problem, Diane, is that car ramming is sadly so easy to do. It's a low-tech event. That's why ISIS, for example, promotes it. You can radicalize lone individuals to go do it. We'll see if that fits this case at all. And you just find an opening. You find a spot like the guy did in Germany to launch the attack. I mean, it's how he could get around whatever barricades. And Jimmy, the gentleman you were talking to earlier, was talking about that he thought the barricades were totally inadequate. This guy figured, what might be interesting is, did the security go down after midnight? That's something else they'll look at. But the key here is he planned this, which could have made this even worse. But, the key is you've got to make sure that you've got everything around this, been previously mentioned, but really digging into his social media, which they're going to use analysts either from the FBI, things that he has ordered. For example, the components to an IED, you can buy all of them online and it's legal. Because separately.
And I want to go back to Elizabeth Schulze at the White House, because Elizabeth, we mentioned before, the president has been briefed. He's been in touch with the mayor. Now we're also hearing from some
on innocent people celebrating the new year in New Orleans. Of course, Mike Johnson is from Louisiana. He says that this is an act of pure evil and justice must be swift for anyone to aid in every part of this investigation. I should say, Diane, Mike Johnson is scheduled to meet with President-elect Trump today at Mar-a-Lago. We have yet to hear anything from President-elect Trump on this just horrific news.
All right, Elizabeth Schulze at the White House, thank you. And for those just joining us, we are going through the latest on this attack in New Orleans. 10 people killed over and out of that truck, opened fire on officers, injuring 2 officers. I want to bring in our senior investigative correspondent, Aaron Katursky. Aaron, what's the latest here, and what do we know about the suspect at this point?
We know the suspect is dead. We know he was shot and killed by police after he fired on New Orleans police officers who were rushing to the scene after the vehicle ramming. The gun officers also found the improvised devices, and they are still searching for a number of other potential devices before they're willing to say that the French Quarter is safe. I think for reasons, consider the possibility of an additional suspect or suspects, whether this person had any help, because this does appear to be a rather sophisticated operation, or at least something that was well thought out, to have a vehicle ramming attack, to have firearms, to have improvised devices. They have planted them in advance of the vehicle ramming. One suspicion right now is that this was meant, and also perhaps as ambulances or other officials flooded into the scene, you would have these improvised devices go off. The authorities have no idea, but that's one suspicion.
The attack. One of those people is Jimmy Cawthorn. He's joining us right now to tell us a little bit more about what he saw there on Bourbon Street. Jimmy, I know this is really difficult to talk about, so we thank you for sharing your story with us. Can you tell me how this all started and what you...
A friend of mine had never experienced New Year's on Bourbon, so I decided to take him. I was a designated driver, so I was sober, remember everything. Everything was fairly normal. Something was going on up there. We weren't really wanting to fight through that. We just figured it was just some nonsense. So we ducked off into a nightclub, and within 2 minutes of being in there, so figuring New Orleans for New Orleans, we thought it was a shooting or something going on that was going to follow into this club. We ran upstairs to the balcony, knowing there was a balcony up there and it would be our better spot. And once we got out there, just a melee of movie prop looking bodies, mangled for both directions. What I would think is it's worse because those people had no heads up, and the footage you're showing there, that is some of the footage that we did not want to share on Facebook, positioning the terrible. And the gentleman down there, he had tire marks on his stomach when they rolled him over to check on him. He also had, just based on body position and blood and more graphic details in this, they wouldn't let us outside. And I'm trained in CPR, personal response, and all of that due to the nature of my job, and they wouldn't let anyone go help. And I understand. Probably 10 of them running down Bourbon towards the direction the truck went with M16s. They basically left in there with our thoughts and visions.
Jimmy, you say that after you went up, you saw police following this truck on foot.
Those green officers there, several like them, I can't say if it's those exact ones, but at least 10 of those were coming from Canal on foot, M16s, ready position, down Bourbon. But the truck was completely out of sight.
And you said you initially thought it might be a drone as an act of terror.
Well, watching my local news and hearing that they've already detonated a couple of IEDs, could have threw those out the window. He could have shot us, at us. I mean, it's hard to contemplate all the what ifs when all you see are these bodies. And you can't imagine someone would want to do this on purpose. This morning, they're not going to be there.
Something that never should have happened, for sure. And Aaron, I saw you nodding as Jimmy was talking about the IEDs detonated. What is the latest on the devices?
There have been a number of items. They have found at least one, possibly two viable devices that were planted around this scene of the vehicle ramming attack once they did controlled detonations. And it does show you what a complex investigation this is turning out to be, with the three-pronged approach to this attack. The grid search throughout the French Quarter for any more possible devices.
And Pierre, this suspect, is dead now, so law enforcement won't be able to question him. But what's going into now figuring out who he was?
Great source of potential information in terms of where the truck was either purchased or stolen. In addition, how was the firearm received, obtained? And I'm also being told that coming on the heels of what took place, enormous pressure on law enforcement throughout the country for large-scale events where large numbers of people are on the street. You'll remember, Diane, that we have the inauguration of his life in recent months. The amount of security in the city was already being stepped up, with several thousand more local officers from the region being brought in to help D.C. police. That was already ongoing. But I think right now, given that the federal government, again, will be under pressure, number one, to brief on this incident as soon as possible, and number two, to give local law enforcement officials around the country say something. That's the message I'm getting from sources this morning.
And I want to go back to former NYPD Chief of Detectives Robert Boyce for a little bit more on that, figure out who this suspect is and more about him.
Well, Diane, there's a very good chance they have a tentative subject already. And that's from multiple abilities, investigative-wise. The car, where did it come from? So you look at these things, where'd that come from? The gun he had, the serial number, the ATF, with their databases available to them immediately, all right? If he had a cell phone. And you would also think, tangible right now to run with. If you remember the 1993 World Trade Center attack, that was made from that identical time right now. There's a big investigation. Once you identify your subject, and then you know so much more than you did prior to that, obviously, if it's a lone wolf or it's an organized attack, which it might be, and that's what they're prepping for right now. Is this part of...
Orleans Mayor Mark Morial for a little bit more reaction here. Mark, what do you make not only of this happening, but hearing that eyewitness Jimmy D says we're not up?
Yeah, I'm extremely concerned if those barricades are not up. And clearly what the leaders of New Orleans, by the time 3 a.m. comes, the crowds begin to dissipate. But the reputation is you party till the sun comes up. But when you're trying to ensure the safety of people, and I think they're going to have to rethink the entire plan around the French Quarter as quickly as possible. Certainly, by tonight, it may be that they've got to close off sections of the quarter to people, except for ingress and egress to hotels. So some modifications are going to have to be made. But certainly, I think the nights are closing. Some bars have closed by then. All have not, because there's no mandatory bar closing time in New Orleans. So there's got to be a lot more. But I think going forward, the leaders of the city have to rethink the entire security and the entire plan. A little bit of that has to be dialed back to ensure people's safety. And I think those barricades, those barriers are going to have to be hardened, and they're going to have to be strengthened. So there's a lot of work that the mayor, the civic community, and the business community need to do fairly quickly, because the French Quarter is an economic engine, not only for New Orleans, but for the state and for the region, special events. I mean, right after and a multiplicity of events. And so it is not tenable to close down the French Quarter for a long period of time. So a lot of work has to be done to harden the security, but also to...
And ensure that, among other things, that there are no explosive devices planted anywhere there. I want to bring back Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas, because, Pierre, in the image that you see of the back of the truck that rammed this crowd on Bourbon...
Obviously, that black symbol can be used as a symbol for ISIS. It can be. And we're being told that recently entered the country. Again, all to be determined. It's a fluid situation early in the investigation. They're hoping to have some answers to that. Also, to give you a sense of the concern, I'm checking with some of my sources in major police departments around the country, and I can tell you they're ask high enough level event, they will send out information to police departments around the country so that those agencies can begin to get a sense of whether they need to augment or change their that is front of mind to law enforcement right now. And again, right now, the amount of resources that are being used to check the fingerprints of this, all these things are being done to try to create a composite picture of this individual to inform them of what this is at the moment. That is the highest priority, and we're waiting for some suspects, sources to give us some updates on where they are in this investigation at this point.
And devices found on scene, law enforcement saying at least one is viable, and now there have been some controlled detonations. What can you tell us about that part?
Good morning. The first thing is they have to make sure that the public's no longer in danger, because people assume that once the shooting stops, that people will use a combination of some sort of a kinetic weapon, a firearm or a vehicle, and they also use explosives, improvised explosives in people. And then they're going to want to forensically exploit whatever's left behind. They're going to look into the explosive devices through my old office at the Terrorist Explosive Device Analytical Center, which is part of the F behind, to see if that sort of tradecraft has been used before, so they can kind of get a clue as to where this person may have learned how to make the devices.
And Scott, you're saying priority number one is ensuring that the public is not in danger now. We are now happened. Jason, I know it's a busy time, so we appreciate you coming on. What can you tell us at this point? What's the latest here?
So the evacuation of the hotels was earlier today, and it's largely due to finding that potential explosive device. Individuals seen tape with when everything else has been closed and shut down. It's an active crime scene. It's a blocks-long crime scene. As your expert just said, our first responders are methodically sort of walking a grid to make sure that there is not potential for further harm.
So, Jason, where does this go now? How do you ensure that lots of big events headed to New Orleans?
Lots of big events headed to New Orleans. Always a number of large events coming to the city. We're a destination city. We punch above our weight. We're not a big city, but we host large crowds on a regular basis, and we have a strong strategy. And I want to be very clear: neutralize this individual. Certainly saved a lot of lives and a lot more injury with their quick work. Completely acting alone. If anyone else knew, if he left any other devices to try to harm more people, and it's all still raw and still too fluid to have all of those answers at this point. But the FBI is taking over the investigation. They're running the lead on it. And that is what they're working on now with our other.
I know you mentioned that one of the questions is whether the suspect was acting alone. Have you any additional information about a possible second suspect?
Too soon to say. Else is there and see what comes. And so our agencies are looking into any and everything now, but too soon to say any more about that.
And in terms of other potential devices and how that grid search is going?
So all I can tell you right now is there are officers methodically walking the street in teams, checking or containers, checking trash cans, just to make sure the public is safe, just to make sure that more explosive devices weren't left sooner or prior to this incident.
Street. Jason, what are you seeing there now?
Hey, Diane, thanks so much. The corner of Royal and Canal is where we are. And yes, it is a block away from Bourbon Street, but it is people that are staying downtown, enjoying some of their time here in the city of New Orleans. And if you take a look, yeah, folks are starting to get up and move around. Coroner's office still out here over my shoulder to the right. Still many law enforcement vehicles out here as well. And yes, law enforcement officers 6 or 7 blocks down, and the same on Bourbon Street, about a good 6 or 7 blocks down, that they have shut off, which is where the center of that crime scene took effect, being called a terrorist attack by everyone involved now. Everyone appears to be on the same page now, and that there is no question that they are considering this. It is being investigated that way, led by the FBI as a terrorist attack. So
William, the district attorney there for the parish where this attack happened. Jason, we know that local law enforcement and the FBI are both now investigating this as an act of terror. What more can you tell us on that front?
They're absolutely asking those questions and looking for that information. May or may not have been involved. Obviously, the prime suspect was neutralized by law enforcement very, very quickly. Thank God. But those are the things that they're actively looking into now, whether it is domestic or otherwise, driving a vehicle, trying to hurt and kill as many people as you can in a short period of time, and then opening fire on officers who were present.
Aaron has another question for you. I just want to open you up to him for a second.
Thanks. Jason, anything on the vehicle? It appears to have been rented, but have you been able to trace anything on the vehicle itself? Is that helping you in the investigation at all?
That's certainly part of it, but I'm not at liberty to discuss that at this time.
Understood. Scope, because this does seem to be a three-pronged type attack with the vehicle ramming, the gunfire, and the IEDs. What's the scope of the investigation?
So, I mean, the scope where he spent his last night, these are all the threads that you have to pull on in an investigation like this. And you just have to follow where those things lead us. And like you said, tell us more. And we just don't have those answers yet.
All right, Jason Williams, the DA for the parish where this attack happened. Jason, we appreciate you coming on with us. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And I want to go back to our Chief Justice correspondent.
Being told by sources, a very senior source, that authorities have a name that they're working with, but it's a very common name. So they're being very careful because they want to make sure that they have identified the exact specific person, because that's how also affiliations and associates of this particular person. But that's a very important development in the case that there is a name that they're working with, trying to make sure that they have identified the precise. They're hoping to have something firm on that in the coming hours, but they have a name that they're working on as the person who could be involved in this incident.
And Aaron, we heard former Mayor Mark. Our conversations, though, right now with that in discussion, saying maybe they shouldn't go forward. What's the latest on that?
I think it is going to go forward. They've had the discussions. They've been able to determine that the game can be played as scheduled with the assistance of law enforcement officers from other neighboring agencies to help with maybe the smaller events, smaller parties that would ordinarily be associated with an event like the Sugar Bowl on New Year's Day. There's often sponsorship parties and that kind of thing. Some of those may end up being canceled, but the game itself, we're told, is going to go on with assistance.
Where does that go?
There's a real question as to whether the barriers that were supposed to be in place were actually in place. There's local reporting that the barriers were in the process of being replaced when this occurred to something maybe more permanent or substantial. You heard the police superintendent say that was really in place. Now, at that hour, did they come down? Was the security as robust? Did they feel they could bring them down and begin to replace them? That will be a frustrating question. Attorney tell us that they're doing a grid search, and I know that involves drones and cameras and just officers walking through the French Quarter through a significant radius to make sure there are no other IEDs or suspicious items that are there. And there have been a number of controlled detonations to render things safe. So everything is secure and that there aren't additional devices that were planted.
And what about looking into additional attacks that may be planned or copycats?
Well, they have to account for the possibility there is a second suspect. The main suspect, as you heard the district attorney say, is dead, shot by police after firing at them, or whether there were other individuals involved. As he said, they have to pull on every thread.
And we are now hearing from President-elect Trump. He just released a statement on the attack, calling it his police department. He then indicated that his administration will support the city of New Orleans with this investigation, and it is sure to be an intense one. So again, 10 people dead in New Orleans, dozens injured, including 2 officers, after this suspect rammed a pickup truck into a crowd on Bourbon Street. Police say he then emerged from the vehicle and opened fire. Found on the scene. Police and law enforcement, including the FBI, leading the investigation, are trying to secure that area and ensure that it's safe. We will have much more coming up tonight on World News Tonight and on ABC News Live as well. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for watching.